The stagecoach lurched to a stop in Florence, Arizona territory, and Grace Oliverson clutched her worn carpetbag tighter, feeling the familiar weight of the chipped teacup wrapped carefully inside pressing against her ribs through the fabric. She had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston with that teacup, the only thing her mother had left her before the fever took her last winter. And despite its imperfection, despite the chip along the delicate rim that made it worthless to anyone else, Grace could not bear to leave it behind when she answered the advertisement for a mail-order bride. The year was 1882, and Florence was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden storefronts baking under the relentless Arizona sun. Dust swirled around the stagecoach wheels as Grace stepped down, her dark green traveling dress already collecting a fine layer of grit. She squinted against the brightness, searching the faces of the few people gathered at the depot for the man she was supposed to marry, a rancher named Samuel Preston, who had written her 3 letters, each one more practical than romantic, detailing the size of his property and his need for a wife to help manage the household. But Samuel Preston was not there. An older woman in a faded calico dress approached, her weathered face creased with concern. "You must be Miss Oliverson. I am Margaret Walsh. I am afraid I have some difficult news. Samuel Preston passed away 4 days ago." His horse threw him, and he hit his head on a rock. "I am terribly sorry you have come all this way." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She stood there in the dusty street, her entire future crumbling before it had even begun. She had used every cent she had for the journey west, had left behind the only city she had ever known, and now she was stranded in a place where she knew no one, with no money and no prospects. "What am I supposed to do?" Grace heard herself ask, her voice sounding small and lost. Margaret reached out and squeezed her arm. "Come with me, dear. Let us get you out of this sun, and we will figure something out. Florence may be small, but folks here look after each other." Grace followed Margaret down the dusty main street, past the assay office and the general store, to a modest house with a small garden struggling against the dry climate. Inside, it was marginally cooler, and Grace sank into a chair at the kitchen table, feeling the full weight of her situation settling on her shoulders. Margaret poured her a glass of water from a clay pitcher. "Drink that. You look ready to faint. When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning, I think." Grace took a long drink, the water lukewarm but welcome. "I will fix you something." Margaret moved efficiently around the kitchen, and soon the smell of frying bacon filled the small space. There are not many unmarried men in Florence, but there are some. "You are a pretty girl, educated from the sound of you. Someone will step forward." Grace was not sure she wanted someone to step forward. The idea of marrying a complete stranger had been difficult enough when it was arranged and expected, but the thought of presenting herself like goods at market made her stomach turn. Still, what choice did she have? She could not return to Boston, and she had no family left even if she could. She ate the food Margaret put in front of her, grateful for the kindness of this stranger. As the sun began to lower in the sky, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange, there was a knock at the door. Margaret opened it to reveal a tall man in dusty clothes, a worn hat in his hands. "Evening, Mrs. Walsh. I heard there was a young woman arrived today, the one meant for Samuel Preston. I wanted to pay my respects and see if there was anything needed." "That is kind of you, Garrett. Come in, come in." Margaret stepped aside, and the man entered, his eyes finding Grace immediately. Garrett Holloway was not what Grace expected a cowboy to look like, though she realized she had no real idea what cowboys were supposed to look like outside of the dime novels she had occasionally glimpsed. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. His face was weathered but kind, and when he looked at her, his gray-blue eyes held genuine concern rather than the calculating assessment she had feared. "Miss Oliverson, I am Garrett Holloway. I worked Samuel's ranch with him sometimes, helped with the cattle drives. I am real sorry about what happened. Samuel was a good man." Grace stood, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway. I appreciate your condolences, though I confess I never actually met Mr. Preston. This is all rather overwhelming. I imagine it is." Garrett turned his hat in his hands, clearly uncomfortable but determined to do the right thing. "Mrs. Walsh, might I speak with Miss Oliverson outside for a moment?" Margaret looked between them, then nodded. "Of course. Grace, you go on." "Garrett is a good man, one of the best around here." Grace followed Garrett out onto the small porch. The evening air was finally cooling, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold but from the strangeness of everything. Garrett leaned against the porch railing, looking out at the darkening street. "I am not good at pretty speeches, Miss Oliverson, so I will just say it plain. You are in a difficult situation, and I find myself in one too, though for different reasons. I have a ranch about 8 miles outside of town. Nothing fancy, but it is mine, paid for fair and square. I run cattle, have about 200 head right now. It is a hard life, lonely too. I have been thinking about finding a wife, but I am not much for writing letters or courting." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "What I am trying to say is, if you need a husband, I am offering. Not out of pity, understand. I genuinely need help with the ranch, and I could use the company. I would treat you right, give you a home and security. I would not expect anything you were not willing to give, and I would do my best to be a good husband to you." Grace stared at him, this stranger who was offering to marry her after knowing her for all of 5 minutes. It should have felt wrong, but somehow it felt less wrong than being stranded with no options at all. At least Garrett Holloway seemed honest, and Margaret had vouched for him. "I do not know what to say, Mr. Holloway. This is all happening so fast." "I know it is, and I am not asking for an answer right this minute. Think on it tonight. But I will tell you true, there are not many options in Florence for a woman alone. You could maybe find work as a laundress or a cook, but the pay would barely keep you fed. And there are men around here who would make you offers that would not be nearly as respectable as mine." Grace knew he was right. She had seen enough of the world to know that a woman without protection or means was vulnerable. "Why are you doing this? You do not know me at all." Garrett turned to look at her directly, and she was struck again by the kindness in his eyes. "I lost my parents 5 years ago to influenza. Lost my younger sister 2 years ago in childbirth, her and the baby both. I know what it is to be alone in the world, to feel like you are standing on the edge of a cliff with nowhere safe to step. If I can keep someone else from feeling that way, and maybe make my own life a little better in the process, well, that seems like the right thing to do." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at his words. "You are a good man, Mr. Holloway. Just Garrett, please. And you should know, I am not a perfect man. I work hard and I am honest, but I have a temper sometimes, and I can be stubborn as a mule according to folks who know me. But I would never raise a hand to you, and I would never betray you. Those things I can promise. Thank you for your honesty, Garrett. May I give you my answer in the morning? Of course, I will come by after breakfast." He settled his hat back on his head and nodded to her. "Try to get some rest, Miss Oliverson. Tomorrow will be easier than today. I promise you that." Grace watched him walk away down the darkening street, his long strides confident and sure. Then she went back inside, where Margaret was waiting with questions in her eyes. "He asked me to marry him," Grace said, still hardly believing it herself. Margaret nodded as if this was exactly what she had expected. "And what did you tell him?" "That I would give him an answer in the morning. "Mrs. Walsh, what should I do? I do not know this man at all." Margaret sat down at the table and gestured for Grace to join her. "No, you do not. But I have known Garrett Holloway for near about 6 years, since he came here and bought that ranch. He is exactly what he seems to be, an honest, hard-working man who keeps his word. He has had his share of sorrow, lost a lot of people he loved. That either makes a man bitter or it makes him appreciate what he has. Garrett is the second kind. But marriage is so permanent. It is. Though out here, if a marriage truly does not work, people find ways to part. I am not saying that would happen, but you would not be trapped forever if you found you had made a terrible mistake. That said, I do not think you would be making a mistake with Garrett. He needs someone and you need someone. Sometimes that is enough to build something good on." Grace thought about the chipped teacup in her bag upstairs. Her mother had loved that teacup despite its flaw, had used it every day for her afternoon tea. "Nothing is perfect," she had told Grace once, "but imperfect things can still be precious." That night, Grace lay in the narrow bed in Margaret's spare room and tried to imagine her life as Garrett Holloway's wife. She would be living on a ranch, learning to manage a household in this harsh climate, married to a man she did not love. But then, she had been prepared to marry Samuel Preston under the same circumstances. At least she had met Garrett, looked into his eyes and seen something there she could trust. By the time the sun rose, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold, Grace had made her decision. Garrett arrived just after breakfast as promised, his hat in his hands again, his expression carefully neutral. Grace met him on the porch, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "I will marry you, Garrett, and I want to thank you for offering me this chance." The relief on his face was evident, followed by something that might have been pleasure. "You will not regret this, Grace. May I call you Grace?" "Yes, of course. When would we marry? How about this afternoon? The preacher comes through Florence on Fridays and today is Friday. If we wait, it will be another week, and I think it would be better for you to come out to the ranch as my wife rather than waiting here. But only if you are comfortable with that." It was fast, so fast it made her head spin, but there seemed little point in waiting. "This afternoon, then." Margaret insisted on giving Grace a better dress to wear, a simple blue cotton that had belonged to her daughter who had married and moved to Tucson. It fit reasonably well, and Margaret helped her pin up her dark hair in a more elaborate style than Grace usually wore. As she looked at herself in the small mirror, Grace hardly recognized the woman looking back. She was about to become a wife, a rancher's wife, in a place she had never heard of until a few weeks ago. The wedding took place in the small church at the edge of town, with Margaret and her husband Thomas as witnesses, along with a few other townspeople who came out of curiosity or kindness. Grace stood next to Garrett in front of the preacher, a gray-haired man named Reverend Matthews, who seemed kind but rushed through the ceremony as if he had other places to be. When Garrett slipped the simple gold band on her finger, his hands were rough and warm, the hands of a man who worked with them every day. When the preacher told him to kiss his bride, Garrett hesitated for just a moment, then leaned down and pressed a chaste kiss to her lips, so quick and gentle that it was over before Grace had time to feel nervous about it. And just like that, she was married. Grace Holloway. A different person than the one who had stepped off the stagecoach yesterday. They stopped by Margaret's house, so Grace could collect her few belongings, and then Garrett helped her up onto the wagon seat. The ranch was 8 miles outside of town, down a dusty road that wound through the desert landscape. Grace sat beside her new husband, acutely aware of how little they knew each other, searching for something to say. "Tell me about the ranch," she finally said. Garrett seemed relieved to have something concrete to discuss. "It is about 500 acres. I have a house, not big but solid, built of adobe to keep cool in summer and warm in winter. There is a barn for the horses, a chicken coop, a root cellar. I have been managing alone mostly, though I hire help for roundup and branding. The cattle range pretty far, but they know where home is. You have many neighbors. The nearest ranch is about 3 miles east, belongs to a family named Carson. Good people. There are a few other spreads scattered around, and then town, of course. It can feel isolated sometimes, but I have always liked the quiet. Grace nodded, taking in the landscape around them. It was so different from Boston, so open and harsh and strangely beautiful. The mountains in the distance were purple in the afternoon light, and the saguaro cacti stood like sentinels, their arms raised to the sky. "What about you?" Garrett asked. "Tell me about Boston." So Grace told him about growing up in a boarding house, where her mother worked as a cook, after Grace's father had died when she was small. She told him about the cold winters and the crowded streets, about learning to read from a kind boarder who had been a schoolteacher, about her mother's death, and the sudden emptiness that had followed. She did not tell him about the boarding house owner who had started looking at her differently after her mother died, whose offers to help had carried implications that made her skin crawl. That was part of why she had answered Samuel Preston's advertisement, to escape a situation that had been becoming dangerous. The ranch appeared in the distance, a collection of buildings nestled against a hillside. As they drew closer, Grace could see that the house was indeed modest, a single-story adobe structure with a covered porch, but it looked well-maintained and solid. The barn was in good repair, and she could see chickens scratching in their enclosure. Garrett helped her down from the wagon, then carried her carpetbag toward the house. "I know it is not fancy," he said, and there was something vulnerable in his voice. "It is wonderful," Grace said, and she meant it. This was her home now, or it would be. Inside, the house was dim and cool. The main room served as kitchen and living area combined, with a stone fireplace at one end and a cast-iron stove for cooking. There was a rough-hewn table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair near the fireplace, and shelves lined with supplies and a few books. 2 doors led off the main room, and Garrett gestured to them. "That one is the bedroom, and that one is a small room I have been using for storage, but we could clear it out if you need it for something. There is a well just outside, good water. The privy is behind the barn." He set her carpetbag down on the table and ran a hand through his hair, suddenly awkward. "Grace, I want you to know that I meant what I said about not expecting anything you are not willing to give. We may be married in the eyes of the law and the church, but I will not force myself on you. I can sleep out in the barn until you feel more comfortable." Grace looked at this man who was now her husband, at the genuine respect in his eyes, and felt something loosen in her chest. "That is very kind of you, Garrett. I think perhaps we could share the room but give each other space. I do not know you well enough yet to be a true wife to you, but I do not want you sleeping in the barn either." "All right, that seems fair." He looked relieved. "Are you hungry? I am not much of a cook, but I can manage bacon and beans and coffee." "Why do you not let me cook?" "I helped my mother in the kitchen for years. Let me be useful." Garrett showed her where everything was, and Grace set about making dinner while he went out to tend to the horses and check on the cattle. She found dried beef, beans, flour for biscuits, and even some preserved peaches that made her smile. The stove was different from the one she was used to, but she figured it out, and by the time Garrett returned, the smell of food filled the house. They ate in companionable silence, and then Grace unpacked her few belongings while Garrett washed the dishes. She pulled out the wrapped bundle containing her mother's teacup, carefully unwrapping the fabric to reveal the delicate china. It was white with tiny pink roses painted on it, and the chip on the rim was about 1/2 inch long, a small piece missing that kept the cup from being perfect. Garrett noticed her holding it. "That is a pretty thing. May I see it?" Grace handed it to him carefully. "It was my mother's. I know it is damaged, but I could not leave it behind. It is all I have of her." Garrett turned the cup in his hands, examining it with care. Then he walked to the stove where the coffee pot was still warm and poured coffee into the chipped teacup. He lifted it to his lips and drank, and when he lowered it, he was smiling. "Tastes perfect to me," he said simply, handing the cup back to her. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes at the gesture, at the way he had understood without her having to explain that the cup was precious despite its flaw, that something did not have to be whole to be valuable. She took the cup from him, her fingers brushing his, and in that moment she felt the first stirring of something that might, in time, become love. That night, they lay in the darkness on opposite sides of the bed Garrett had built himself from rough lumber, a careful distance between them. Grace could hear his breathing, slow and steady, and the unfamiliar sounds of the desert night outside. She thought about the strange turn her life had taken, how just 2 days ago she had been on a stagecoach expecting to marry a man named Samuel Preston, and now she was here, married to someone else entirely, starting a life she could never have imagined. "Garrett," she whispered into the darkness. "Yes, thank you, for the teacup, I mean, for understanding. Everyone has something chipped or broken inside them, Grace, does not make them worth any less." Grace fell asleep thinking about those words, about a man who could see value in imperfect things. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Grace woke before dawn to make breakfast while Garrett tended to the animals. They ate together, and then Garrett would ride out to check on the cattle while Grace managed the household. She cleaned and organized, mended Garrett's worn clothes, tended the small vegetable garden behind the house that had been neglected. In the evenings, they would eat dinner together and sometimes sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. They talked more easily as the days passed. Garrett told her about his childhood in Texas, about moving to Arizona territory with his family to start fresh, about his dreams for the ranch. Grace told him about the books she loved to read, about missing the ocean even though Boston Harbor was nothing like the wild Pacific, about learning to see beauty in this harsh desert landscape. But they still maintained that careful distance, sharing a bed but never more than accidental touches in the night. Grace sometimes woke to find Garrett had moved closer in his sleep, his arm flung out across the space between them, but he always woke and moved away with an apology. A month after the wedding, Grace was in the chicken coop collecting eggs when she heard horses approaching. Garrett was out with the cattle, so she went to see who was arriving. 2 men on horseback pulled up near the house, and Grace felt a prickle of unease at the way they looked at her. "Afternoon, madam," the first one said, though there was nothing polite about his gaze. "We are looking for Garrett Holloway. He is out on the range. May I ask what this is about? Just need to talk to him about some business. When do you expect him back?" "Not until evening." "You are welcome to ride out and find him if it is urgent." The second man leaned forward in his saddle. "Are you his wife? Heard he went and got himself married to some mail-order bride." Grace lifted her chin. "I am his wife. And I would appreciate it if you would state your business or move along." The first man smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. "Feisty. I like that. Tell Garrett that Jack Mercer came by. Tell him we need to talk about water rights. Some of his cattle have been drinking from the creek that runs through my property, and I do not appreciate it. I will give him your message." The men sat there for a moment longer, making Grace uncomfortable with their scrutiny, and then they finally turned their horses and rode off. Grace went back inside, her hands shaking slightly. She had never been afraid in her life at the ranch until that moment, When Garrett returned that evening, she told him about the visitors. His expression darkened. Jack Mercer is trouble. That creek he is talking about has been used by everyone around here for years. It is not really his, though his property does border it. He has been trying to charge people for water access, trying to force the smaller ranchers to sell out to him. What will you do? Talk to him, I suppose. See if we can work something out. But Garrett looked troubled, and at dinner he was quieter than usual. That night, a storm rolled in across the desert, lightning forking through the sky and thunder shaking the adobe walls. Grace lay awake listening to the rain hammer on the roof, grateful for the moisture but nervous about the violence of the storm. Next to her, Garrett was also awake. "Garrett, are we in danger from this Mercer man?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I do not know. Jack Mercer is not someone to take lightly. He wants to control all the land around here, and he is not particular about his methods, but I am not going to let him push us around." "Us," Grace repeated softly. "I like that we are an us." She felt Garrett turn toward her in the darkness. "We are married, Grace. I know it was not a normal courtship, and I know we are still figuring each other out, but you are my wife. I will protect you and this ranch with everything I have." Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the room, and Grace saw Garrett's face clearly for just a moment. Saw the determination there and something else, something deeper. When the darkness returned, she found herself moving closer to him, closing the distance they had maintained for weeks. "I am glad I married you, Garrett Holloway. I want you to know that." She felt his hand find hers in the darkness, his fingers rough and warm as they intertwined with hers. "I am glad too, Grace, gladder than I can say." They lay there holding hands while the storm raged outside, and Grace felt something shift between them, some invisible line being crossed. When she finally fell asleep, it was with her hand still in Garrett's, and she slept better than she had since arriving in Arizona. The next morning, Garrett rode into town to talk to the sheriff about Jack Mercer. Grace spent the day baking bread and trying not to worry. When Garrett returned in the late afternoon, he looked grim. "The sheriff says there is nothing he can do unless Mercer actually breaks the law. He suggested I try to work it out with him directly." "And will you?" "I suppose I have to. I am going to ride over to his place tomorrow." Garrett hesitated. "Grace, I want you to know where there is a rifle in the house, just in case. It is in the chest at the foot of the bed." "Do you know how to shoot?" Grace shook her head. "No, I have never held a gun." "Then I am going to teach you. Come on." They walked out away from the house as the sun lowered toward the horizon. Garrett showed her how to hold the rifle, how to aim and squeeze the trigger gently. The recoil startled her the first time, but Garrett was patient, standing behind her and guiding her hands, his body warm against her back. "I do not want to scare you," he said quietly, "but I need to know you can protect yourself if something happens." "Nothing is going to happen to you, Garrett." "Probably not. But probably is not the same as certainly." They practiced until Grace could hit the target Garrett set up, a tin can placed on a fence post. When they walked back to the house, Garrett kept his arm around her waist, and Grace leaned into him, grateful for his solid presence. That evening after dinner they sat on the porch and watched the stars emerge. The sky in Arizona was so vast, so full of stars that it still took Grace's breath away. "I am going with you tomorrow," she said suddenly. Garrett looked at her in surprise. "Grace, that is not a good idea. If there is trouble, then you should not face it alone. I am your wife, Garrett, for better or worse, remember." "I remember, but I also remember promising to keep you safe. We keep each other safe. That is what marriage is it not?" Garrett studied her face in the dimming light, and then slowly he smiled. "All right, you can come. But you stay in the wagon, and if I tell you to leave, you leave." "Agreed, agreed." They set out the next morning, following the creek east toward Jack Mercer's property. The Mercer Ranch was larger than Garrett's, with a sprawling ranch house and multiple outbuildings. Several men were working around the property, and they all stopped to watch as Garrett's wagon approached. Jack Mercer came out onto his porch, thumbs hooked in his belt. He was a big man, running to fat, with hard eyes and a smile that never reached them. "Holloway, glad you decided to come talk, and you brought the little woman, how nice." Garrett climbed down from the wagon but gestured for Grace to stay put. "Jack, your men said something about water rights." "That is right. That creek runs through my property, which means the water is mine. You want your cattle to drink from it, you pay me. That creek has been open-range water since before either of us got here. You cannot just claim it. I can, and I am. You have a problem with that, take it up with the territorial governor. Of course, by the time that gets sorted out, your cattle will be mighty thirsty." Mercer's smile widened. "Unless you want to sell me your property, I will give you a fair price. My ranch is not for sale." "Everything is for sale for the right price, Holloway. Think about it. You are just one man with one little ranch. I am offering you a way out before things get difficult." Garrett's hands clenched into fists. "Is that a threat, Mercer?" "It is a fact. Accidents happen out here. Fires, stampedes, all kinds of unfortunate events. Would be a shame if something happened to that pretty wife of yours." Grace saw Garrett go very still, and she climbed down from the wagon despite her promise to stay put. "Mr. Mercer, surely we can come to some reasonable arrangement about the water. We are all neighbors here." Mercer's eyes traveled over Grace in a way that made her skin crawl. "I can think of an arrangement. You spend a little time with me, sweetheart, and I will let your husband's cattle drink all they want." The words hung in the air for a moment, and then Garrett moved, faster than Grace had ever seen anyone move. He crossed the distance to the porch and grabbed Mercer by the shirt, yanking him forward. "You ever speak to my wife like that again, and I will kill you. That is not a threat, Mercer. That is a promise." Two of Mercer's men started forward, but Mercer held up a hand. "Easy, boys. Holloway here is just leaving, but you remember what I said, Holloway. The offer to buy you out stands for another week. After that, well, we will see what happens." Garrett released him and stepped back, his face flushed with anger. He took Grace's arm and helped her back into the wagon, then climbed up beside her and turned the horses around. They rode away in tense silence, and Grace could feel the rage radiating from Garrett. When they were a mile from the Mercer Ranch, Garrett pulled the wagon to a stop and sat there, his hands gripping the reins so tight his knuckles were white. "I am sorry you had to hear that. I am sorry I brought you here. Garrett, this is not your fault. That man is vile. He threatened you, Grace. He looked at you like you were something he could just take, and I wanted to kill him for it." Garrett turned to her, and there was anguish in his eyes. "When he said that, when he suggested that I have never felt anger like that in my life, and I realized something." "What?" "That I love you. I know it has only been a month, and I know we got married for practical reasons, but somewhere along the way, I fell in love with my wife. And the thought of anything happening to you made me realize I would do anything, anything at all, to keep you safe." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "Oh, Garrett, I am not expecting you to say it back. I know you probably do not feel the same way yet, and that is all right. I just needed you to know in case something happens." Grace put her fingers on his lips to silence him. "Nothing is going to happen. And Garrett, I think I am falling in love with you too. These past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your kindness and your strength, the way you drink coffee from a chipped teacup and call it perfect, how could I not fall in love with you?" Garrett stared at her for a long moment, and then he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. Not the chaste kiss from their wedding, but a real kiss, full of all the feeling that had been building between them. Grace kissed him back, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, and for a moment the whole world disappeared except for the two of them. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I will figure this out with Mercer. I will keep you safe and keep our home, I swear it. I know you will, and I will help you. We are in this together." They drove the rest of the way home in a different kind of silence, one charged with new understanding and new possibilities. That night, when they lay down in bed, there was no distance between them. Garrett pulled Grace into his arms, and she went willingly, resting her head on his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Tell me about your sister," she said softly. "You mentioned her before, but you never talk about her." Garrett was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. Then he began to speak, his voice low and filled with old grief. "Her name was Lucy. She was 5 years younger than me, and she was the sweetest person you ever met. Always saw the good in everyone. She married a farmer named Daniel, and they were so happy. When she got pregnant, she was over the moon, but the birth went wrong. The baby came too early and Lucy bled too much. They both died within hours of each other." Grace tightened her arms around him. "I am so sorry, Garrett. It about killed me, losing her. She was the last of my family, you know. After our parents died, it was just the two of us. Daniel lost his mind with grief, ended up drinking himself to death within a year. I swore then that if I ever found someone to love, I would appreciate every single day I had with them, because you never know when it is all going to end. Is that why you have been so careful with me, so patient, partly? But also because you deserved someone who would give you time, who would not just take what they wanted without caring about what you needed. You have had enough hard things in your life, Grace. I wanted to be something good for you." "You are," Grace said, tilting her face up to kiss him. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me." They made love for the first time that night, slow and tender, discovering each other by touch and whisper. And afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Grace felt truly married for the first time, truly bound to this man who had drunk from a chipped teacup and seen its worth. The next few days passed peacefully, but both Grace and Garrett knew it was temporary. Jack Mercer was not the kind of man to let things go. Garrett rode out every day to check the cattle, always carrying his rifle, and he taught Grace to shoot well enough that she could defend herself if necessary. A week after their visit to the Mercer ranch, Garrett rode into town to pick up supplies and talk to the sheriff again. Grace stayed home, working in the garden and trying not to worry. But when afternoon came and Garrett had not returned, she began to feel uneasy. She was standing on the porch scanning the horizon when she saw smoke rising in the distance from the direction of the north pasture. Her heart dropped. Garrett had been planning to check that pasture today. Grace ran to the barn, saddled Garrett's spare horse with fumbling hands, and rode toward the smoke. As she got closer, she could see flames spreading through the dry grass, being pushed by the wind toward the section where Garrett often worked. Terror gripped her heart. She found Garrett near the creek, trying to dig a fire break with a shovel, his face black with smoke and sweat. When he saw her, his expression was a mixture of relief and fear. "Grace, what are you doing here? You need to get back to the house. The fire is moving toward you." "We need to get out of here. The cattle, they are trapped on the other side." Grace looked past the flames and saw what he meant. About 30 head of cattle were milling in confusion, cut off from safe ground by the advancing fire. Without thinking, she kicked her horse forward, riding around the edge of the fire line. Garrett shouted after her, but she was already moving. The smoke was thick and choking, and the horse was terrified, but Grace urged it forward. She got behind the cattle and started driving them toward a gap in the fire line, yelling and waving her arms. The cattle began to move, slowly at first and then faster as panic set in. Grace rode with them, guiding them through the gap, her lungs burning from the smoke. By the time she got the cattle to safety, Garrett was there, his face white with fear and anger and something else. He grabbed her off the horse and crushed her against him. "Do not ever do something like that again. You could have been killed, so could you?" Grace pulled back to look at him. "The cattle are safe. Now we need to put out this fire before it reaches the house." They worked together through the afternoon and into the evening, digging fire breaks and beating out flames with wet sacks. By the time the fire was finally contained, both of them were exhausted and covered in soot. They rode back to the house in the darkness, too tired to talk. But the next morning, when Garrett rode out early to assess the damage, he found evidence that the fire had been deliberately set. There were burnt matches scattered near the point where the fire had started and tracks from several horses. When he told Grace, her face hardened. "Mercer. Probably, though I cannot prove it, and even if I could, the sheriff would not do anything. Mercer has connections. So what do we do?" Garrett was quiet for a long time. "I do not want to sell, Grace. This ranch is ours, it is our future, but I will not risk your life for it. If you want to sell and start over somewhere else, I will do it." Grace thought about running, about letting Jack Mercer win. Then she thought about the home they were building together, about the life they were creating. She thought about Garrett drinking from a chipped teacup and calling it perfect, about understanding that imperfect things could still be precious. "No, we do not run. We fight." "Grace, I mean it, Garrett. This is our home. If Mercer wants it, he will have to take it from us, and I do not plan to make that easy for him." Garrett looked at her with love and admiration and just a touch of exasperation. "You are the stubbornest woman I have ever met." "I learned from the stubbornest man I have ever met." That afternoon, Garrett rode to the Carson Ranch 3 miles east and talked to John Carson about forming a coalition of the smaller ranchers. If they banded together, they would have more power to stand up to Mercer. Carson agreed immediately, angry about Mercer's attempts to control the water and tired of being pushed around. Over the next week, Garrett visited every small rancher in the area. Most of them joined the coalition, all of them tired of Mercer's bullying. They agreed that any attack on one ranch would be considered an attack on all of them, and they would defend each other. When Mercer heard about the coalition, he was furious. He rode to Garrett's ranch with 6 men, but Garrett was ready for him. John Carson and 3 other ranchers were already there, all of them armed. Mercer pulled up short when he saw them. "What is this, Holloway? This is you understanding that you cannot push us around anymore, Mercer. We are united now. You come after any one of us, you come after all of us. And we outnumber you. You cannot prove I had anything to do with that fire. No, but we all know it was you. And if anything else happens, we are going to the territorial authorities, and we are going to keep making noise until someone listens. You are not as connected as you think you are." Mercer's face was red with anger, but he could see he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "This is not over, Holloway." "Yeah, it is. Go home, Mercer. Leave us alone and we will leave you alone. Keep causing trouble and you will regret it." Mercer wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following. Grace, watching from the porch, finally let out the breath she had been holding. Garrett turned to shake hands with the other ranchers, thanking them for their support. "We watch out for each other now," John Carson said. "That is how we survive out here." After the others had left, Grace walked out to where Garrett was standing, still watching the horizon as if expecting Mercer to return. She slipped her hand into his. "It is really over." "I think so. Mercer is mean, but he is not stupid. He knows he cannot win this fight now." Garrett turned to her and smiled. "We did it, Grace. We protected our home. We did it together." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and that evening they sat on the porch and watched the sunset, the sky turning shades of orange and purple and gold. Grace leaned against Garrett's shoulder, feeling more at peace than she had since arriving in Arizona. "You ever miss Boston?" Garrett asked. "Sometimes I miss the ocean or the way the city smelled in spring, but no, I do not miss it. This is my home now. You are my home." Garrett kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Grace Holloway. I love you too." Autumn came to the Arizona Territory, bringing cooler temperatures and relief from the relentless summer heat. Grace had been feeling strange for a few weeks, tired in the mornings and queasy, and when she missed her monthly courses for the second time, she began to suspect why. She rode into Florence one morning while Garrett was out with the cattle and found Margaret Walsh at her home. Margaret took one look at Grace's face and smiled. "You are expecting, are not you?" Grace nodded, feeling overwhelmed and excited and terrified all at once. "I think so." "How did you know?" "I have had 3 children of my own and helped birth a dozen more. I know the look." "Have you told Garrett?" "Not yet. I wanted to be sure first. What if something goes wrong? He lost his sister in childbirth." Margaret took Grace's hands in hers. "I will not lie to you and say nothing could go wrong. Childbirth is dangerous and women die. But you are young and healthy, and I will be there with you when the time comes. And you need to tell Garrett. He will want to know." Grace told him that evening as they sat down to dinner. She set the chipped teacup in front of him, filled with coffee, and said, "I am going to have a baby." Garrett froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. "What? I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby, Garrett." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and Grace began to worry that he was not happy about it. But then he set down his fork and came around the table to her, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Grace, we are going to have a baby. Are you happy about it?" "Happy? I am terrified and thrilled, and God, Grace, I love you so much. Thank you for this." They held each other for a long time, and when Grace looked up, she saw tears on Garrett's face. She reached up to wipe them away. "I know you are worried because of Lucy, but I am going to be all right. We are going to be all right. I cannot lose you, Grace. I cannot. You will not. I am stubborn, remember. Too stubborn to let anything happen to me or this baby." Garrett laughed despite his tears and kissed her fiercely. "Yes, you are. The stubbornest woman in Arizona Territory." The pregnancy progressed and Grace's body changed, her belly swelling with their child. Garrett was attentive to the point of being overprotective, trying to keep her from doing any heavy work, worrying constantly. Grace found it both touching and frustrating. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she told him one day when he tried to stop her from carrying a basket of laundry. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I can still do normal things. I know, I just worry. I know you do. But you need to trust that I will tell you if something is wrong. I am not going to take unnecessary risks." Winter came, mild by Boston standards but cold enough that they spent more time indoors. Grace sewed tiny clothes for the baby while Garrett carved a cradle from wood he had been saving. They talked about names and the future, about the life their child would have. One evening in late January, Grace said, "Tell me about your parents. I want our child to know about their grandparents." So Garrett told her about his father, a quiet man who had loved horses, and his mother, who had been a skilled weaver and had taught Garrett to appreciate beauty in small things. He told stories about growing up in Texas, about learning to ride and rope and all the skills that had made him the man he was. "They would have loved you," he said, "and they would have been over the moon about this baby." "I wish they could have met you," Grace said. "I wish a lot of things were different, but I am glad we have each other." As Grace's due date approached, Margaret Walsh came out to the ranch to stay with them. Garrett had wanted Grace to move into town for the birth, but Grace had refused. She wanted to have their baby at home, in the house they had built together. The labor started on a cool morning in March. Grace woke with pains in her back, and by midday, the contractions were coming regularly. Margaret sent Garrett outside, telling him he would just be in the way, and Garrett paced the porch like a caged animal, listening to Grace's cries from inside the house and feeling helpless. John Carson came by to check on them and found Garrett sitting on the porch steps with his head in his hands. "She is going to be all right, Garrett. You do not know that, my sister, your sister is not Grace. Grace is strong. Have faith." The hours dragged on and the sun began to set. Inside, Grace was exhausted and in pain, but Margaret kept encouraging her, telling her she was doing well, that the baby was coming. And finally, as the last light faded from the sky, Grace gave a final push and felt the baby slip from her body. There was a moment of terrible silence, and then a thin wail filled the air. Margaret laughed. "It is a boy, Grace. You have a son." Grace collapsed back against the pillows, crying with relief and joy. Margaret cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a blanket, then placed him in Grace's arms. He was tiny and red and perfect, with a fuzz of dark hair and eyes that seemed too big for his face. "He is beautiful," Grace whispered. "Garrett, I need Garrett." Margaret went to the door and called out. Garrett came running, his face pale with fear. When he saw Grace sitting up in bed, holding the baby, his legs nearly gave out with relief. "It is a boy," Grace said, smiling through her tears. "We have a son." Garrett knelt beside the bed, staring at the baby in wonder. "He is so small. Is he all right? Are you all right?" "We are both fine." "Do you want to hold him?" Garrett took the baby with shaking hands, cradling him carefully against his chest. The baby blinked up at him, and Garrett's face crumpled. "Hello, little one. I am your father, and I promise I am going to do everything I can to be a good one." They named him Henry, after Garrett's father. Little Henry was a good baby, sleeping and eating and growing steadily. Grace recovered from the birth quickly, and soon the house was filled with the sounds of a child, crying and cooing and eventually laughing. Garrett was besotted with his son, spending every free moment holding him or watching him sleep. He built a larger house the next year, adding 2 more bedrooms because, as he said, "Henry is going to need brothers and sisters." And he was right. 2 years after Henry was born, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, and 2 years after that, another son they named Samuel, after the man whose death had brought Grace to Arizona in the first place. Each birth was easier than the last, and each child was healthy and strong. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and cycles. The ranch prospered, and so did the coalition of small ranchers. Jack Mercer eventually gave up trying to control the territory and moved away, selling his ranch to a family from California. The Carsons became close friends, and their children grew up playing together. Grace's chipped teacup held a place of honor on the kitchen shelf, and sometimes Garrett would take it down and drink from it, always saying the same thing: "Tastes perfect to me." And every time, Grace would smile and kiss him, grateful for a man who understood that imperfect things could still be precious. When Henry was 10 years old, he asked his mother how she and his father had fallen in love. They were sitting on the porch, shelling peas, while Garrett worked with the horses in the corral. Grace thought about how to answer. Well, it was not like the stories in books, where 2 people see each other and know right away. Your father and I got married before we really knew each other at all, but we chose to love each other every single day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, and that choice made over and over became real love. But how did you know he was the right person? Grace looked out at Garrett, who had stopped what he was doing to watch them, smiling. I knew because he saw the broken parts of me and did not try to fix them. He just accepted them, the way he accepted my mother's chipped teacup. He understood that you can love something even if it is not perfect, maybe especially if it is not perfect. Henry nodded, filing this information away with the solemn seriousness of a 10-year-old. Then he ran off to help his father with the horses, and Grace sat there in the afternoon sun, watching her family and feeling more grateful than she could express. That evening, after the children were in bed, Grace and Garrett sat on the porch as they had done so many times before. Garrett had his arm around her, and she leaned into him, breathing in the familiar smell of leather and sunshine that always clung to him. "What are you thinking about?" Garrett asked. "That night on the stagecoach coming to Florence, I was so frightened. I had no idea what I was walking into, no idea that I would meet you, or that we would build this life together. Sometimes I think about that younger version of me, scared and alone, and I wish I could tell her that everything was going to be all right, better than all right. Do you ever wish things had been different? That we had courted properly, had more time before we married?" Grace turned to look at him. "No, not even for a moment. I think if we had met under different circumstances, we might never have really seen each other. Sometimes difficult circumstances reveal people's true character in a way that ordinary life never could. And what I saw in you from the very beginning was goodness and strength and kindness. That has never changed. I love you, Grace, more every day. I love you too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. In the distance, a coyote called, and closer by, one of the horses whinnied. These were the sounds of home, the sounds that had become as familiar to Grace as her own heartbeat. Years continued to pass. The children grew, and eventually they started to leave. Henry went to work on a ranch in Texas, learning the cattle business from a different angle. Rose married a young lawyer in Florence and stayed close by. Samuel showed an interest in horses and began breeding them on a corner of the ranch Garrett had given him. Grace and Garrett grew older together, their hair graying, their hands showing the marks of hard work and time. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by shared experiences and deepened by time. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Garrett surprised Grace by having a special dinner prepared by the hotel in Florence. He hired a buggy to take them to town, which made Grace laugh because she could not remember the last time they had gotten dressed up and gone anywhere fancy. She wore a dress Rose had made for her, deep blue with fine embroidery, and Garrett wore his best suit, brushing his hair back with water until it laid flat. At the hotel restaurant, which was the finest establishment in Florence, they ate steak and potatoes and pie, and Garrett gave her a gift. It was a new teacup, fine china with pink roses just like her mother's cup, but this one was perfect without any chips or flaws. Grace held it carefully, admiring the craftsmanship. "It is beautiful, Garrett, thank you. I thought maybe you would like to have one that was not damaged. Something perfect for once." Grace set the new cup down and reached across the table to take his hands. "I appreciate the thought, I really do, but you know what? I prefer the chipped one. It has history. It has meaning. It is like us, like our life together. We have been through hard times, we have scars and flaws, but that is what makes everything precious. Perfection is boring. Give me something real any day." Garrett smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she loved. "You know what? I think that is why I fell in love with you. Most people spend their whole lives chasing perfection, but you understand that the beauty is in the flaws. We are a pair of chipped teacups, you and I, perfect for each other." They laughed together, drawing curious looks from other diners, but they did not care. They were too happy, too comfortable with each other after 25 years of marriage to worry about what other people thought. On the ride home, Grace leaned against Garrett's shoulder and watched the stars wheel overhead. "Do you remember that first night after you asked me to marry you? I was so scared. I was terrified. I thought I had made a terrible mistake rushing you into marriage like that, but I could not seem to help myself. From the moment I saw you standing there at Margaret's house, looking lost and brave at the same time, I knew I wanted to protect you. And then I got to know you, and protection turned into respect, and respect turned into love. I am glad you rushed me. I am glad for every choice that led us here." More years passed, bringing grandchildren who ran through the ranch house the way Henry, Rose, and Samuel once had. Grace taught them to cook and garden, while Garrett taught them to ride and rope. The house they had built was full of life and love and noise. When Grace was 58 years old, she got sick. It started with a cough that would not go away, and then she began losing weight and having trouble breathing. The doctor in Florence said it was her lungs, weakened perhaps by all those years of breathing dust and smoke. There was not much he could do. Garrett refused to accept it. He took her to Tucson to see specialists, but they all said the same thing. Grace's time was limited. She might have months, maybe a year if she was lucky. Grace accepted this news with more grace than Garrett could manage. She had lived a full life, she told him. She had loved and been loved, had raised 3 children who had turned into good people, had built a home and a legacy. Not everyone could say that. "But I am not ready to lose you," Garrett said, his voice breaking. They were sitting on the porch at sunset, as they had done thousands of times before. "I do not know how to live without you, Grace. You will manage because you are strong, and I will not really be gone. I will be in the wind and the sunset and the morning coffee. I will be in that chipped teacup on the shelf and in the faces of our grandchildren. Love like ours does not just disappear because one of us is not here anymore. I know. But I will miss you every day for the rest of my life. Good, because I will miss you too. But Garrett, I need you to promise me something. Do not shut yourself off when I am gone. Stay connected to the children and the grandchildren. Keep living. I could not bear to think of you just giving up. I promise, but it is going to be hard. Most things worth doing are hard." We learned that together. Grace lived for another 8 months. They were good months, filled with family visits and quiet evenings on the porch. She was in pain sometimes, but she bore it without complaint. She spent her days putting her affairs in order, writing letters to her children and grandchildren to be opened after she was gone, making sure Garrett would be all right. On a warm evening in May, with Garrett holding her hand and all 3 of their children gathered around, Grace took her last breath. She was looking at Garrett when she died, and she was smiling. The funeral was held in the Florence church, and it seemed like the whole territory came to pay their respects. Grace had touched many lives in her years in Arizona, had been known for her kindness and strength. The cemetery was on a hill overlooking the desert, and as Garrett stood at her grave, he thought about how much she had loved this harsh, beautiful land. The weeks after were the hardest of Garrett's life. He moved through each day automatically, doing what needed to be done but feeling hollow inside. The ranch seemed empty without Grace's presence, without her laughter or her voice calling him in for dinner. One morning, about a month after Grace had died, Garrett was making coffee when he saw the chipped teacup on the shelf. Without thinking, he took it down and poured his coffee into it. When he lifted it to his lips, he remembered the first time he had done this, the day Grace had unpacked her mother's treasure and shown it to him. He had drunk from it then and called it perfect, trying to show her that he saw value in imperfect things, and Grace had understood. She had seen what he was really saying, that he saw value in her, in their hastily arranged marriage, in the life they were starting together. From that moment, something had shifted between them. Garrett stood in his kitchen, drinking coffee from a chipped teacup, and felt tears running down his face. But mixed with the grief was gratitude. He had loved Grace Holloway for 29 years, and she had loved him back. How many people could say they had found that kind of love? He kept his promise to Grace. He did not shut himself off. He stayed involved with the ranch, though Samuel did most of the work now. He visited with Rose and her family in town, and Henry came back from Texas twice a year to see him. The grandchildren kept him busy and reminded him that life continued, that love continued, even after loss. Garrett lived for another 12 years after Grace died. He was 81 years old when he had a heart attack while riding out to check on the cattle, just the way he would have wanted to go. Samuel found him near the creek, still in the saddle, looking peaceful. They buried him next to Grace on the hill overlooking the desert. At the funeral, Rose told the story of the chipped teacup, about how her father had drunk from it that first day and called it perfect, about how that simple gesture had been the beginning of a great love story. "They taught us that love is not about perfection," Rose said, tears streaming down her face. "It is about acceptance. It is about seeing the flaws and loving anyway. It is about choosing each other over and over through good times and hard times. And that is a legacy worth more than any amount of land or money." The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through the generations. The chipped teacup was kept as a family heirloom, a reminder of where they had all come from. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, if you stood on the porch of the old adobe house, you could almost feel the presence of two people who had loved each other deeply, who had built something lasting in a harsh land, who had proven that imperfect things could be the most precious of all. The story of Grace and Garrett became a legend in Florence, told and retold over the years. It was a story about second chances and about finding love in unexpected places. It was about the courage it took to start over in a new place, and the strength it took to build a life with a stranger who became the love of your life. It was about understanding that the best things in life are often chipped and worn and imperfect, and loving them anyway. Years after both Grace and Garrett were gone, Henry's granddaughter was going through old family papers and found the letters Samuel Preston had written to Grace before his death, the letters that had brought her west in the first place. She also found Grace's responses, formal and careful, so different from the passionate letters Grace had later written to Garrett when they were occasionally separated. Reading those early letters, it was clear that Grace had been prepared to marry Samuel out of necessity, nothing more. And reading the later letters, it was obvious that what she had found with Garrett was something completely different, something transformative. One letter in particular stood out, written by Grace to Garrett when he had gone to Texas to help Henry get established on his new ranch. In it, Grace wrote, "I was thinking today about that chipped teacup, the one you drank from on my first day here. I realized that cup represented everything I was afraid of back then. I was damaged goods, broken by circumstances beyond my control, and I thought that made me worthless. But you looked at that cup and saw it differently. You saw it as something precious, something that deserved to be used and appreciated despite its flaw. And in doing that, you taught me to see myself differently too. You taught me that I was worthy of love, that my past did not define my future. That is the greatest gift you ever gave me, even greater than your love, though I treasure that above all things. You made me whole by accepting me as broken. I will love you for that until the day I die and beyond." The granddaughter wept when she read those words, understanding for the first time the depth of what her great-grandparents had shared. She had the letter framed and hung in her own home, a reminder of what real love looked like. The house where Grace and Garrett had lived was eventually restored and preserved as a historical site. Visitors could walk through the rooms where they had raised their children, could stand on the porch where they had spent countless evenings watching the sunset, could see the chipped teacup displayed in a glass case in what had been the kitchen. And every year, on the anniversary of Grace's arrival in Florence, a small ceremony was held at the house. Descendants of Grace and Garrett would gather, along with townspeople who appreciated the story of two people who had built something beautiful in a harsh land. They would share food and stories, keeping the memory alive. The teacup became a symbol for the town of Florence itself. Just as Grace had been broken and made whole again, Florence had gone through hard times and emerged stronger. The town adopted an image of a teacup with a chipped rim as part of its historical logo, a reminder that imperfection was nothing to be ashamed of, that it was part of what made things real and valuable. The ranch continued to prosper through the generations. Samuel's son expanded the horse breeding operation, and it became known throughout Arizona Territory and beyond. Rose's descendants became prominent in Florence civic life, including 2 mayors and a territorial judge. Henry's children spread out across Texas and New Mexico, carrying the values their grandparents had instilled in them wherever they went. But no matter how far they traveled or how successful they became, every descendant of Grace and Garrett Holloway knew the story of how their family began. They knew about a young woman who came west carrying a chipped teacup, about a cowboy who drank from it and called it perfect, about a love that started out of necessity and became something rare and beautiful. It was a story about seeing value in unexpected places, about choosing to love even when it would have been easier not to, about building a life together through challenges and hardship. It was a story about the American West, about people who came with nothing and created something lasting. It was a story about the best parts of the human heart, the capacity for kindness and growth and enduring love. And it all started with a simple gesture. A man drinking coffee from a chipped teacup and understanding what the woman watching him needed to hear. That imperfect could be perfect. That broken could be whole. That 2 strangers could become soulmates if they were brave enough to try. Grace and Garrett's story proved that love was not something that just happened to you like in fairy tales. Real love was a choice, made over and over again in big ways and small ways, every single day. It was choosing to see the best in someone even when they were at their worst. It was standing together against whatever life threw at you. It was finding beauty in the ordinary and meaning in the mundane. It was drinking from a chipped teacup and calling it perfect, not because you could not see the flaw, but because you understood that the flaw was part of what made it precious. Because the flaw meant it had a history, had survived, had been loved enough to be carried thousands of miles by someone who could not bear to leave it behind. In the end, Grace and Garrett's love story was not just their own. It belonged to everyone who heard it, everyone who needed to believe that second chances existed, that love could be found in unlikely places, that it was never too late to start over and build something beautiful. Their story lived on not just in the memories of their descendants, but in the hearts of anyone who had ever felt broken and hoped to be made whole again. The chipped teacup sat in its glass case in the old adobe house, a silent witness to a great love story. And if you looked at it long enough in the right light, you could almost see Grace's hands wrapping it carefully before her long journey west. You could almost see Garrett's calloused fingers lifting it to his lips. You could almost feel the moment when 2 lives intersected and became one, all because a cowboy understood that perfect love was not about perfection at all. It was about acceptance, about commitment, about choosing each other every single day. And that was a lesson worth preserving, worth passing down through generations, worth celebrating. Because in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving, the story of Grace and Garrett Holloway reminded people that love could conquer almost anything, that broken things could be mended, and that sometimes the most beautiful love stories started with the simplest of gestures and grew into something that would outlast time itself.